Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited to be here. To give a little bit of an introduction, I'm Izzy. I lead our enterprise partnerships here at Micro One, and I'm joined by the lovely Imran, who leads our AI research organization. And we're here today to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about enterprise AI adoption, what barriers there are, how we're working with enterprises to do contextual evaluations to help them understand what's going on inside of their agentic systems and how agents can actually improve inside production. So these are a lot of conversations that we're having internally. So we thought that we would just open it up to our broader community. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. And if we have some time at the end, we will be able to answer some and chat about it. So yeah, to set the scene a little bit, almost every enterprise that we've been talking to is, of course, very excited about AI and very actively investing in it. Many of these companies already have a lot of agents in production. Teams are really building and deploying AI at a large scale. But what we're also seeing is that these businesses are really starting to hit a ceiling when it comes to deploying these agents across their organizations. They want to move faster and automate more meaningful work, but they don't yet have the exact confidence to let AI make more complex decisions inside their real business processes. So these leaders within these organizations are trying to, understand, but struggling to understand how their AI is behaving inside these real workflows, especially when it comes to more ambiguous or high stakes decisions or processes and decisions that would be hard to reverse and could result in a lot of risk for their business. So as a result, a lot of the agents we're seeing are constrained to more low impact tasks, even when the upside could be a lot bigger. And what we're seeing as, the barrier here and the prevention is really the common factor of trust. These companies don't have insight into how things are going with their agentic behavior, where things are going wrong, why they're going wrong, how they're going wrong, and how it can be improved. So, to kick things off, Imran, I'm curious from your perspective why you think trust has become such a limiting factor for enterprise adoption.
Yeah, that's a great question, Izzy. So just before I kind of answer the question, I'll give a little preface as to why I think agents in particular have caused such an issue in terms of enterprise adoption. So if we go back to sort of classical data science and machine learning, those models were sort of very well understood, and you had metrics associated with the performance, which were easily, you were easily able to monitor. Sort of fast forward onto sort of basic generative AI. Typically, the way it's done is you look at use cases. So, for example, you could have a summarization use case, you could have a retrieval augmented generation use case, you could have just sort of a general content generation use case. And for each one of those use cases, you can have certain well-defined metrics. Now, these could be sort of classical natural language-based processing metrics, or you could have some type of LLM as a judge variant. So when you don't have a ground truth. The thing with agentic is the non-determinism really compounds for when you have an agent, which is an LLM-based system, where you have given it tools, additional forms of context. So you're suddenly taking a problem and just sort of increasing the variance of what the agent can do. And also another thing is that for enterprise domain-specific tasks, the metrics associated with it are not that well defined. So, for example, you could have an HR agent, right? So it's not so easy to determine, okay, if something's performing well and something's performing badly, right? So I think a lot of these agents that have been in development in a non-production setting, sort of pre-production setting, it's a lot more easy to design sandboxes where you can monitor them. But once you actually release them into the wild, I think the three critical issues is around performance, reliability, and accountability. And I think that's one of the key areas, or three key areas really, for enterprise adoption or lack of thereof.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So what are you seeing kind of on that note? What are you seeing as the most common, kind of failure modes when agents are hitting these real workflows? What is typical that's really going wrong, kind of more underneath the hood?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in general, one of the issues for when folks have decided to go from pre-production to production is, okay, what are you going to monitor? Right. I think it's sometimes the question is more difficult than the answer. So, for example, if you're deploying an agent, it's not very clear what you want to monitor. So you kind of deploy it and see basic level of performance. But we've seen a variety of issues of agents that go live, that start hallucinating or start factually being incorrect, not
Mm.
looking at the corporate sort of document context correctly, various failure modes we've seen throughout. And I think that's kind of halted adoption as well, because whenever this type of issue happens in an enterprise, it's typically a lot of red tape. So I think the failure modes have been quite wide in variety, and that's led to a timidness in the ability to put them into production. But I think the core area, once again, is around monitorability, around what we actually want to monitor in terms of an agent performance. And once you've got that lever down, is, well, how do you overcome those performance barriers that you're facing, right? So it's a sort of a two-pin problem. So that's really the area that what we're targeting, and we're hoping that can increase the enterprise agentic adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that, we've talked about internally and we're trying to understand is that a lot of these companies that we're meeting with, they are, trying to monitor their agents, or, they're using more traditional benchmarks and QA checks, but how do you think these compare to what's really needed to strongly evaluate agents, kind of comparing what companies are doing today versus what's insufficient about those tasks and those measurements?
Yeah, another great question. So I think a lot of the community in general are focusing a lot on benchmarks. Now, you can kind of gamify your agent to do better on benchmarks, but I think that the key thing is that those benchmark tasks are not really representative of the tasks that enterprise are dealing with. So you're really comparing kind of apples to oranges. So you can say, oh, this particular agent or particular model is very good at X, Y, and Z. But if ultimately you're not testing X, Y, and Z in your platform and in your enterprise, then you really have to take those sort of results with a pinch of salt. So I think one of the issues at the moment is a certain focus on benchmarks. And that, for a number of reasons, it's not a good idea, because the way you develop models for benchmark purposes in terms of performance is very different to how you should be developing an agent, for example, enterprise use cases. So I think it's, once again, an apples to oranges mix there.
Yeah, it makes that makes a lot of sense. It seems like these companies really need more specificity when it comes to their exact use cases and the exact scenarios that they're facing, given even their own company policies, or, a unique workflow or language that they like to use. So it makes sense why a more generic or traditional benchmark might not always completely fit the bill. But so getting into contextual evals a little bit, this is a word and a term that's been, you know, becoming a little bit more popular in a lot of conversations we've been seeing and having. So maybe just starting completely from ground zero, can you describe, very simply, when we talk about contextual evals, what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? And how would you define that on a more beginner or basic level?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will begin by saying I think the gap between AI capability and realized enterprise impact isn't really driven by economics or access to models, because we've got plenty of them. It's really by the absence of rigorous contextual evaluation. So, what do we mean when we say contextual evaluation? Now, there's various sort of domains that agents are utilized for. So once you have an agent working in a particular domain, you want to sort of have a checklist of what the agent is doing well and what it's doing wrong, right? And one proponent of that is looking at the failure modes of that agent, right? So evaluations are sort of tasks that one develops in order to uncover or elucidate what type of failure modes that an agent has. Because going back to what I was saying earlier, once you understand the failure modes of an agent, you can then overcome those. But if you don't really know what you're monitoring, that's one potential issue. So, for example, let's say if an agent is using a particular tool or a particular search, that could be what is sort of one failure mode over there. But you develop those failure modes within your structure of contextual evals, which is sort of a domain dependent. So the key thing about contextual evals is dependent on the domain that you're interested in, they highlight the failure modes of where your model is not performing correctly.
Got it. Yeah, the way I think of it is kind of like a report card in a sense to understand exactly where things are going right, where things are going wrong, and seeing those exact gaps or where, or the term failure mode. So that makes a ton of sense. And why do you think this needs to be, something we've talked about a lot is that a lot of companies maybe do this randomly or on a one-off kind of test, but what do you think the benefit is of doing contextual evaluations on maybe a more continuous basis rather than a check here and there at a random time?
That's a great question. So I'm going to start off with an analogy. I used to be a tennis player, right? So the last thing you want to do is wait till the final tournament to determine if you're doing well or not, right? So you kind of want to know as you're going along during the how many other months or weeks that you're training, if performance is, developing at a good rate. So you can have match plays and things like this. So the same type of thing applies with continuous monitoring of any real system, right? If you're looking at performance of a system, you want to test that performance at consistent ways and consistent times to ensure that model performance is either increasing or maintaining, or if it's not performing well, what things you can do to rectify, right? So continuous modeling and monitoring gives us a real way to probe the system continuously, and that way we can highlight if there are any defects or if there's any issues that come up. I'd love to say that we can develop a system where we wouldn't find failure modes, but at the same time, inputs can vary, things can drift. It's a lot of it is very different. So continuous monitoring, I think, is an essential part, not just for this, but it's critical for agentic adoption, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, now that we've kind of laid the ground for identifying where things go wrong, something that's come up a lot is the concept of fine tuning. And so it's one thing to understand where your agents are failing and how they're failing and why they're failing. And then people kind of automatically say, all right, let's fine tune them. Let's fix this up. But could you maybe just walk through a little bit how, teams are thinking about this and why they're assuming that fine tuning will just, by itself might fix reliability issues. But can you just kind of explain maybe the relationship between evals and fine tuning and how you think they, can develop separately or work together? I'm curious about the relationship there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I view it is more like an end-to-end performance optimization problem. And fine-tuning is one way that you can move a knob, but it's not necessarily the only way. So you could have different model selection and comparisons. You could look at sort of inferencing differences. For example, if you have a RAG architecture, you can look at what knowledge base that you have, your retrieval mechanism. There's several things that you can do. Of course, you can use prompting strategies. So the ultimate idea is you want to create optimization. Now, there's a few ways that you can do optimization. For example, you could do optimizing the model performance itself, or you could look at optimizing system performance, right? So typically you have a system where a model is connected to various components. So you can look at the architecture as a whole and consider that optimization, or just optimization of the model performance. But the ultimate goal here is really end-to-end optimization, and those are two separate components. So fine-tuning absolutely can help with things, but it's not the only lever that one can pull to get a overall system level performance increase.
Got it. And, when you're thinking about, where to start, like when a company is coming to us, a lot of these enterprises that have agents already in production, let's say, why do you think it's more important to start with an eval, contextual eval, rather than, they might say it's a chatbot isn't answering these kind of questions right. Like we just want data to fill this in right away. So why do you think, sometimes it makes more sense to start with the eval first rather than jumping into, more direct data training?
Absolutely. So I think it kind of comes to the idea of this agent feasibility analysis. So agent feasibility analysis and contextual evals kind of go hand in hand. So before even designing the evaluation, what you should typically do is look at performing an agent's feasibility analysis. Now,
Mhm.
this doesn't really measure sort of model quality, but it determines whether the problem is actually well suited for agent automation, right? Where risk can be concentrated. So this could look at sort of task complexity, context, appendix, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you have a clear idea on the agent risk and complexity profile, then you can start building the idea of contextual evals to systematically surface those failure modes rather than produce sort of a single aggregate accuracy score. So I would say it kind of goes hand in hand. So what I would typically advise is you do an agent feasibility analysis, and that kind of informs you on the contextual evals itself.
Got it. That makes sense. And how kind of on that note, how do you determine when fine tuning is warranted versus something that is more a system level change or a system level modification is needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that kind of goes back to the previous point of system performance as well as model performance. So if you're looking for optimizing end-to-end optimization, which is the ultimate goal, you want the whole system to be optimized. Model performance is a component of that. So if you're developing evals and you see that the system is the model is clearly not performing as expected, that's when you may look to either model selection or fine tuning to increase model capabilities. But once again, it's an overall optimization point of view. So I wouldn't jump straight into fine tuning. Sometimes that can be the best approach, but another approach is you may not need as much fine tuning, if at all, to get a desired level of performance. So once again, that's a threshold that one defines.
Got it. I think something that would be really helpful for me and probably for a lot of people on this call is if you have maybe an example kind of end-to-end process that we could walk through. I know a lot of, we're throwing a lot of terms out there, but something that has been really helpful for me is seeing all of this come to life. So is there an example, either, project that comes to mind or system that you think would be helpful just to help bring everything to life?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to brainstorm on the call. So let's suppose that a mid to large enterprise with existing ML AI capabilities has a regulatory compliance review agent, right? So the agent would have certain responsibilities. This could be reviewing contracts or internal policy documents. It could flag potential regulatory or legal risks or suggest a compliant alternative or revisions, something like this. So the first stage, once again, goes back to my previous point of what we would look to do is sort of perform an agent feasibility analysis. So this kind of goes into four brackets. So tasks complexity. So is it sort of open-ended? Is it a single step, multi-step, etc.? So the type of context dependence, right? Is there hidden or implicit context, or is there long documents, multi-source documents, etc.? Looking at the error tolerance, so what type of error is okay, and the severity of incorrect outputs, because in certain domains it could be worse. So in this
Mhm.
particular case, if you're flagging incorrect information, that's not brilliant. And then this type of informs you to build the contextual eval design. So these are scenario-based, sort of content-rich, and really the aim here is to design the contextual eval such they probe the edge cases and ambiguity, with the aim that they should be diagnostic rather than leaderboard oriented. And then what the evaluation will then capture is really four type of things. So it's going to capture the failure type itself associated with this agent. It's going to capture the severity of that, the recoverability, and then the idea hypothesized root cause. So that gives us a very nice idea to then say, okay, we can design tasks associated with those failure modes with the idea to overcome those failure modes from a model learning perspective. And then you can do your downstream model and agent improvement, whether this is fine tuning or preference-based reinforcement learning, whatever you want to do. And then you can, once again, once the model's been improved performance, you can then do your reevaluation. And that sort of through last three parts becomes a continuous loop.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe, Imran, could you just talk a little bit about why, we at Micro One feel it's so important to have human experts in the loop here? And maybe, if you're using a contract example from maybe a legal workflow or something in finance, whatever it might be. But could you maybe just touch on, how we we include human experts from various domains in the loop in all of these processes as well. I think that's a very important point to touch on, just given what we're seeing, and a lot of things are becoming so automated. But I think human intelligence is something at the end of the day that can't ever fully be replicated. So making sure that it's at the core of these processes is so essential. But curious just on your take, and maybe bringing that to life with a specific domain example in this case.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's worth pointing out here that, less than 1% of enterprise information is within these base sort of LLMs, right? So clearly the base level cases is not well suited for enterprise. So what you can do to overcome that is with human expert signals. Now, human expert signals are really sort of clear and repeatable, right? And they have a level of intuition which you aim to, for example, automate, right, in terms of your model development. So human data is really the cornerstone of developing intuition and framework that you can transfer to the model itself, right? So I think a key area is dependent on what domain that you are looking at. Now, this could be healthcare, this could be tax, it could be various things. The cornerstone of a model improvement in this case really comes from the human data, the expert data. So that's, I would say, overall the most important thing. I think data in this case is a little bit like fuel, right? If you're putting bad fuel into a car, the car's not going to perform very well. But if you're putting top quality fuel in, the engine's going to work as expected. And that's just the same with models, right? You have to have quality data. And that's something that we really do pride ourselves on at Micro.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we're inching up on time here, to pull things back a little bit more high level, if if you were in an enterprise kind of running the AI agent organization or running a certain type of agentic system, what would you be asking yourself or asking your team? Like, what kind of questions would you be thinking through? What areas would you be making sure that you're covering before you go out and deploy an agent that you're working on? What do you think is really important to make sure that you have a clear base understanding or expectation of before you launch these agents into production?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say the three critical elements is performance, reliability, and accountability. If you don't have a good handle on either one of those, I think that's going to stall adoption and create various problems. So I would say in terms of performance, monitorability is really key, right? So you need to develop an intuition or a framework to monitor your agent performance, right? Now, as again, this could be sort of classical metrics that you develop or associated metrics, more modified, but still you need to have a way of monitoring performance, right, of an agent that's live. If you don't have that, you'll get several issues. The second of which is reliability, right? If something's in deployment, you need to ensure that it's reliable. No one wants to have good performance for a week and then the following week it's just completely gone in performance. And then the third thing is around accountability. So you want to have an idea as to what decisions the agents are making and why, and make sure you can sort of trace that back. So if I'm an enterprise, I would want to make sure I've got a critical handle on those three areas. And those three areas tie incredibly appropriately to contextual evaluation, because contextual evaluation really gives you those three things. It gives you, okay, for example, what should I be monitoring in terms of performance, right? It gives you an idea about the reliability associated with failure modes. And it gives you an idea of the accountability aspect around it as well in terms of these failure modes. So I would really want to get a good handle on those three critical areas: performance, reliability, and accountability. And that would be a good basis for base level agent development, and then look to improve on that.
Got it. And, similarly, are there any red flags you've seen from enterprises that are trying to deploy these agentic systems that really is a clear sign, aside from those three things, that as a signal that an organization is not ready to deploy a system?
Yeah, I think once again it kind of falls back to those three things, but I think majority of the errors that I've seen in enterprise is when they don't have a good handle on one of the three or related ones, right? So if they don't
Mhm.
have a good idea of what they're looking to monitor, right? If they don't have a good idea about what type of information input that the agent's going to have, and if that varies, what type of output variance that you have. Um, Another issue is around orchestration, right? If you're developing a multi-agent system, how does one orchestrate that? And then another critical area is around governance. So governance sort of has two aspects. You've got the model monitoring capabilities, and then you've got the risk and controls associated with those. So I would say various failure modes from what I've seen in enterprise AI. It sort of once again ties back to contextual evals, but it's part of a broader spectrum of issues that I've seen, particularly from when going from pre-production to production.
Got it. And maybe just last question for you here, and then we'll let someone else do the questioning in the chat if we have some time. But how do you see the evolution of contextual evals over the next year, 10 years, as more and more agents are deployed across organizations and everything from the simple tasks that many of them do today to more key high stakes decision making within real workflows?
That's a great question. And in terms of the complexity of an agent and their domain specific use cases in terms of severity, I think contextual evals will only get more important. At the moment, agents are utilized for chatbots and things that are not overly sort of red tape and potentially dangerous. But as we see agents more into that space of around sort of more developed automation, I can only see that correlating incredibly well with contextual evals. I think every agent itself needs to have a form of continuous monitoring, which will come from contextual evaluation. But I only see that developing further. So I expect for enterprise AI adoption of contextual evals to go through the roof, because that's the only legitimate way that you can realize the enterprise benefit and impact, right? Which is not driven by economics or access to models, but by rigorous contextual evaluation. So I see that being a new frontier. And hopefully, as we see it expand, we can look towards standardized workflows for contextual evaluation. But I always think that domain-specific contextual evals, sort of for really niche areas, will always be critical. But overall, I would like to see a standardization across the board.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right, so we're gonna answer a couple of questions here. I know we're at our 30-minute mark, but given we start a couple minutes behind, we'll try to get to a couple of these that are in the chat. So maybe to start off with this one, someone in the chat named Bryce said, how qualified slash capable are enterprises to run these contextual evals? If you're asking someone whose job may be impacted to run that, is there a way to ensure objectivity?
Right. Good question. So I think in terms of enterprise running these contextual evals, essentially what you're doing is making inferences. So it's not inherently difficult. I would say the difficult part about it is the development of the contextual evals themselves, not necessarily running them. But for example, we have great experience in terms of developing those contextual evals. So I would say in terms of enterprises running them, there shouldn't be a huge blocker. But I would say the development of the contextual evals is the tricky part there. But interested to hear what you think, Izzy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, a lot of enterprises, of course, enterprise is a bucket term. We work with companies that are very small. We work with companies that are in the Fortune tens of the world. And so it's been really interesting to partner with these businesses and it really is a partnership because it's essential for us to have their enterprise knowledge. And I think working with a partner like Micro One in turn helps a lot because we can bring a little bit more objectivity to the board, especially when we work with a group of domain experts. So if we're working on a finance project and working with a bunch of experienced financial analysts or planners or whatever the domain might be, helping, it's kind of a marriage of three different worlds. We come from the human data and AI side, these teams come from their unique and specific workflows. And bringing that together, I think, is what helps keep all parties honest and going through multiple layers of quality control as well to understand, you know, to make sure that everyone is on the same page, nothing is slipping through the cracks, I think really helps make these enterprises capable and, qualified to be running these evals in partnership with experts and whoever their partners might be. So okay, maybe we have time for one more. I think this is a good question. How is evaluating an AI agent different from traditional software testing?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I would say overall, the non-deterministic aspect of agents provides additional complexity compared to traditional software testing. Like if you're developing a software, you can develop unit tests, right? So, programmatically, you can check something quite easily, but the same you cannot do with an agent, right? So various inputs will map to different outputs depending on your inferencing. Everyone would like it to be deterministic, but it's by design not that way. And I think that creates a problem. Whereas if you're checking things programmatically for software, one input typically always equals one output, but that's just not the same with agents. So as you have a single agent and then you can chain that into multi agents, you sort of get this variance which permeates through and then increases. So you then end up with an output which can vary a lot. So I think that creates an issue. But one thing to do there is take a big problem like a multi-agent system and then just break it down into single agents. And from there, what tools you have, what types of context infusing things that you've got. There's various ways that you can break it down. But I would say it's quite a bit different to traditional software testing, which is largely deterministic.
Great. Awesome. I think, well, there's a lot of questions in the chat. We'll do our best to reach out to everybody that has asked questions. Thank you all for your curiosity and engagement. And thank you, Imran, for fielding all of these questions so well, and really appreciate your insight. But yeah, thank you everybody so much for joining. If you have more questions or if you're curious in learning more, or if you want to debate or chat, our inboxes are always open. So please reach out and we'll see you on the next one. All right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Izzy. Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.